Okey dokey. Good morning, Aaron. Perfect. Okay. So we are going to wrap up chapter 11 today. We are going to talk about things like special districts, school boards, etc., and some of the issues we see with local governments. So last time we talked about how county governments are created and a little bit about the types of city government. So another type of city government that can be used is called the mayor-manager system. In this one, the city manager only reports to the mayor, not the entire council. So this is problematic because then we start to see power disputes. The city council wants one thing, the mayor wants another, and then you start to see issues over who's going to get what. And so some mayors have tried to give themselves more control, give themselves more power. By and large, this has failed. They have not been successful in being able to take control. So it's not the most effective form of government. And here in Texas, it's used in Fort Worth, but it's not as common because it's just not as effective. Okay. So the last form of city government we'll talk about is called the commission government. And this originated in Galveston. And basically the way it works is the commissioners are elected at large. So they run for a certain segment of the city. They represent District 1 or 5, etc. Now they are designed to create policy as a board. So the budget, figuring out issues like public safety. Create the policy as a board, but each commissioner administers a department like transportation, public safety, education, and so on. So this tends to be problematic because they don't advocate for the needs of the entire city, but for what they want for their department. Because they want to look good, right? They want to be able to say, we've increased mass transit in the city, or we hired more police officers. They're not advocating for the entire city. And this does tend to lead to problems of corruption and unclear lines of responsibility. So it's hard to know who to hold accountable. And this form of government really only works if the commissioners can put their ego aside and actually work with each other. So after Hurricane Ike in 2008, when Galveston was devastated, they were actually able to work together as a board to help the city rebuild. So it can work if they're willing to be a little bit more flexible and work with each other. But that's pretty rare. So it did work in terms of hurricane relief, but it's not exactly the best form of city government. All right, so if a city has less than 5,000 citizens, or it hasn't been designated home rule, it's considered a general law city. There are about 881 Texas cities that are considered general law cities. So the smaller cities tend to take the mayor-council form of government. But they don't necessarily need a full-time city government. If your city has 200 people in it, you don't need a full-time city council. So sometimes what they'll do is share a manager with another smaller town nearby. Hire someone to work part-time. A graduate student in a public administration program makes a great part-time city manager. So they don't have to do it full-time, and they can learn on the job, apply what they're learning to the job. Sometimes they'll share that person, give them a part-time role, and they'll go from one town to another as needed. It's kind of cost effective if you hire one manager between 3 towns versus one for each town. And so this person will serve multiple roles. It can be the general manager, personnel director, tax collector. It could even be law enforcement. They're going to have to wear multiple hats because they're not going to be making a lot of money as the city's manager. So they're going to be working a couple of different jobs. It's not uncommon for someone to be a business owner but also work for the city. Okay, so generally speaking, city politics in Texas follow certain guidelines. The elections are nonpartisan, meaning there is no party label next to that candidate. And the municipal elections are held in the spring, usually an odd number of years. So they're not held at the same time as the presidential or midterm elections. So because they don't run on a party platform, we do tend to see private interest groups sponsoring candidates. Ad hoc groups forming around an election to sponsor a candidate. So maybe a realtors association supports candidates who are seen as pro-business, pro-city growth, which does mean cities do tend to reflect business interests because they're not running through a party, but through basically the support of local businesses. They also tend to use what's called a place system. The council is designated by seats, so seat 1, seat 2, seat 3, and you have to live in that district, and you're only running against someone for the same seat. So you're running against another candidate for seat 3, not the entire city council. So sometimes this means there's only one candidate for a seat, or sometimes there's 5. It just depends. Sometimes the voters just don't have a choice because one person runs. And this system is usually used in smaller cities. All right. A lot of cities use the district system. So candidates are required to live in the geographic area that they're trying to run for. So if you want to run for a position in East McAllen, you need to live in East McAllen. And you're only running against candidates from the same area. And this is the result of lawsuits that showed that citywide elections made it harder for minorities to get elected. So what happens is you're not picking a candidate from the entire city. You're picking a candidate from your district. You're picking someone who lives in your area. You might even know them if it's a small enough area. And this is beneficial because it's cheaper. You only have to campaign in your district, not across an entire city. It also allows for more minority representation. If you're a minority and you're running in a district that is fully or mostly made up of people who are considered minorities, then you have a better chance of winning. If you're African American in Houston and you're running in a predominantly African American district, you have a better chance of getting elected. So it's cheaper for the candidates, and it does allow more minority representation, reflecting more of the diversity of the city. When they run, yes, they do, Johnny. They're given a number, so your District 5 or District 10 or whatever. So yes, the city decides the districts, and then the candidates have to run in that district. Yes, yeah, good question. Yeah. So on election day, you go to your polling place and you only see the candidates for your district. You don't see the others.
I don't know what district you belong to.
Usually, you can either look that up, or you'll probably get information in the mail from a candidate saying, I'm running for this district. And yes, Johnny, you can only run in the district you live in. Yeah, you could try to find out that information. Usually there's information before the election on like local news sites about here's which district is which, and you can find out that way. Also, I do believe on the voter registration card, it will say what district you are in for city elections. Yeah, good questions. The problem with this is there are concerns about people focusing on the needs of their district and not the entire city, which is possible. You want to win re-election, so you're going to focus on the people in your district. But this does tend to be a bit more beneficial because you don't have to be wealthy to run, and it does create a more diverse city council. I actually had a colleague in my department who ran for city council in McAllen. Didn't win, but I mean, you don't have to be a millionaire to run for city office if it's a district system. So you do get better representation. You do get more diversity, and more of a reflection of the city as a whole. And city politics are a great first step for someone who wants to run for office down the line. You can start running for city council, then mayor, and then work your way up. So it's a great first office for someone new to politics who wants to work their way up. Start off local and work your way up the ladder. Okay, so nonpartisan elections are tricky. We don't have a lot of information on the candidates. And when you don't have a lot of information, you tend to vote based on party affiliation. But if there's no party identity, how do you know whom to vote for? How do you know which way to go? It's also partly the reason why our Texas state parties aren't as strong. They don't have that local grassroots connections. They can't run candidates at the local level. So they're not going to be as strong compared to states where they can participate in local elections. Now, the biggest advantage is it does help you to focus on local issues. You can look at what they're going to say about school districts, or the drainage system, or the quality of water. Of course, the flip side of that is you actually have to pay attention to local issues to know how to vote. So it's rare to see more than 5 to 10% voter turnout. Usually voter turnout in these elections is only high when it's something people are really concerned about, like improving the drainage or building a new school. So we don't tend to see a lot of participation, especially amongst minorities. So this, unfortunately, is the type of election where it would be very easy to cheat. Because if only 5% of voters show up, how do you know someone legitimately won the election? It would be a lot harder to determine if someone actually cheated in this election if the majority of the electorate stayed home. You wouldn't know different. Okay, so then we're going to switch gears from discussing city politics to discussing the various special districts that we have across Texas. Special districts are a local government unit that performs a very specific, limited function. So they only work in one area. Here in Texas, we have about 3,679 special districts. 1,079 of them are school districts. Now that's a lot, but we are actually second in terms of the number of special districts. Illinois has the most. So second longest state constitution, second largest number of special districts. About a fourth of special districts are dealing with issues like housing and community development, and another fourth are dealing with water, drainage, supply, sanitation, and so on. Every county has at least one school district, possibly hundreds in the larger cities, and a tax appraisal district. So the number of school districts is going to depend on the size of the city. We also have airports or special districts, municipal utilities like water, hospitals, fire prevention, and community colleges. Community colleges have different kind of rules and controls. They're not controlled by local agencies. They're controlled by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and the Texas Education Agency. Partly because community colleges are, different sounds wrong, but they are. A lot of students who are attending community colleges are first in their families to go to college. Not necessarily well off, older students. So they want to make sure these community colleges are well regulated. That you don't have students graduating from a community college but not getting a proper education, not coming out with an actual associate's degree. So why do we have special districts? What's the point? Well, some problems go beyond city and county governments. If there's a hurricane and it causes massive flooding, that's a problem a city can't handle on its own. It's even a problem a county can't handle on its own. The massive floods that we got in 2018, that required special assistance. The cities could not handle it on their own. So you've got to have agencies that can help with unique, special kind of cases. We're also needed to deal with debt limits placed on local governments. The cost of special districts can be shared between multiple cities or counties. So to deal with the debt limits, you don't have to raise taxes. If you share the cost of a new hospital between 4 or 5 different cities, then the debt isn't going to place a huge burden on one particular city. It's also a way to keep the state legislature from having to deal with these problems. Obviously, the government in Austin can't handle the day-to-day business of the Rio Grande Valley. The state is too big for the legislature to have to be in charge of every single issue. So if we create special districts down here, then what the legislature has to do is throw some money or policy at it and let us do what we need to do. It can also help with things like building up companies, building a new hospital. Improving water can be controlled by one company. A construction company that's small can make a name for itself by building a new high school or getting the contract to build houses in a new subdivision. That does lead to the secondary problem of possible corruption, but the idea is at least local companies can benefit. It also allows for more flexibility with airport districts. Cities can choose to have one airport serve 2 different cities. There's the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport that services both cities. It's why we can have an airport in McAllen, but also one in Harlingen. So we can have multiple airports to serve the needs of the people of the valley. But you have some flexibility about which airport you go to. Southwest only flies out of Harlingen, so if you absolutely want to fly Southwest, you're going to go to Harlingen. If you don't particularly care and McAllen's closer, you've got the option, at least. And there's a little less politics involved. People tend to focus on the issue at hand and work pretty well together with each other. It's not all symbiotic, but it's a little bit less contentious. It's also why there's like 2 airports in Dallas, 2 airports in Houston. You've got the smaller Houston airport, and then you've got the really big one. So you can pick which one you want to fly out of. And of course, special districts do have problems of their own. They're not very democratic. There's less visibility and there's less knowledge about how they work. We don't necessarily pay attention to these special districts. We don't necessarily know how much it costs us, who's running them, and what the policies are. We only tend to pay attention when they're not functioning. Again, take the example of the flooding in 2018. People looked at the water districts and the water drainage and said, why the hell didn't we have better drainage, right? Why did we have this massive flooding? So people don't necessarily pay attention unless there's a problem. They're also not that economical. The costs do tend to get passed on to us. If you want to build a new school, you have to finance it through bonds. But those bonds tend to have very high interest rates, and the cost of those get passed on to the taxpayers. So if you want to build a new school, you're probably going to see an increase in your property taxes. And they're not super stable. Sometimes the money for a project just never happens. Sometimes the district needs more money, but the voters won't approve it. They're also not clearly created or defined. So there tends to be confusion about who's in charge of what, where you designate responsibility, and they don't tend to be as efficient. And it's also harder to hold them accountable because we don't necessarily know who's in charge. If there's a problem, they'll point fingers at each other and basically cause a whole bunch of confusion, and we won't know how to hold them responsible. And they're essentially small solutions to big problems. Building a new school doesn't necessarily tackle the issue of unequal access to education. In Houston, they could probably afford to build a very nice new high school. Not so much here, right? So you still have the problems of inequality in education, lack of mass transit in some areas. It's a small solution to a bigger problem. It can solve the problem for now, but it's not going to fix the long-term problems. So school districts are one of the most common type of special districts. And school board members are elected. Here in Weslaco, a couple weeks ago, with the election, there was local elections for school board positions. So school board members are elected. Their decisions are publicized. And there does tend to be more public interest and knowledge. If you have a child in school, you want to know what that school is doing. You want to know where there's budget cutbacks, issues with teachers, concerns about violence in the school, firing a teacher. So if a school board meeting is going to be somewhat controversial or contentious, there's going to be a lot of people showing up. And sometimes this does turn into an actual all-out physical brawl between people. It can get really ugly. So people tend to pay more attention to that. They want to know their children are getting a good education. But there aren't issues with teachers having sex with students, things like that, right? You gotta make sure that's not happening, although it does still happen. But we are seeing a reduction in the number of school districts because areas are consolidating and sharing the cost. If you have two communities that only have about 6,000 people between them, why would you create two separate school districts? You might as well create one combined middle school, high school, etc., and send all the kids there. There's, which also means there's a little bit less choice. If you like your local school and it gets closed down and consolidated, too bad. There's not much you can do about that. And again, the quality of education is going to vary. There's almost 1,100 school districts in Texas. And there's going to be a lot of differences in how well funded and how good the education system is. And part of that is because schools are largely funded by property taxes. So the wealthier the area, the better the schools. If you live in a wealthy suburb of Austin, your kid's probably going to a class where there's maybe 15 kids in a classroom. There's all sorts of extracurricular activities, tutoring, computer labs, fill in the blank, right? The poorer school districts, maybe they're one of 30 in a class. Textbooks are a bit outdated. There's not as many extracurriculars. So, unfortunately, part of the problem with education is the better off your parents, the better your education is going to be. Now, there is some state assistance for education, but the state only funds about half of the public education costs. And when there's a budget deficit, education is usually one of the first things that gets slashed. So in all likelihood, when the state legislature meets again next year, the education budget is going to take a hit. So unfortunately, relying on the state and property taxes means the education system is fundamentally broken at heart. There has to be a better way to fund education, but until someone figures out what that is, you're just kind of stuck with what you got. And I'm not knocking teachers in the poor school districts. They do the absolute best that they can, but it would be nice if someone would throw them a bone once in a while, you know, make their jobs just a little easier. Okay, so how do local governments come up with the money? How do they pay for everything in their budget? Part of it is local property taxes. And these are assessed based on the real value of the property of a house or a commercial space. So if a house is worth something like $250,000, you'll get taxed a certain rate. If it's only worth $50,000, it's going to be taxed a lower rate. If you want to open a business in downtown San Antonio, you're going to be paying a lot more in property taxes. Part of it's based on location. Part of it's based on how big of a house we're talking about. Like a 3-bedroom house is going to pay more in taxes than a 1-bedroom house, right? That's just kind of the reality of it. So part of it is the local property tax. Some of it is also what's called a revenue bond. The voters will have to vote to fund a project like a new sewer system, or here in Westboro, improving the drainage during floods. So what happens is the city issues bonds to pay for the cost of the project, and then you basically help pay for this. So they pass the cost on to the consumers. You get a slight increase in your basic sewage fee with your water bill, or a slight increase in property taxes to pay for a new high school. So the cost of paying it off is essentially passed on to the users. You basically agree to pay back the debt the government takes out to benefit the city. And there's also the ability to charge a fee like a water fee, landing fees at airports for the various airlines, and college tuition is a user fee. The money that you pay here at South Texas College helps keep the college open, helps fund the technology, um, salaries of faculty and staff, etc. So if you ever look at all of those charges you get when you book an airline ticket, usually there's something like the 9/11 fee, the landing fee, and all of that. So we do help pay that as well. And sometimes they charge airlines a noise pollution fee if they're in like a pretty populated area, something like that. And there's also the intergovernmental transfers. Um, the money from the federal and the state government gets passed down to the local government. If Congress says we need to create reliable mass transit across the United States and gives Texas, let's say, $50 billion to create a reliable mass transit system, the state of Texas will then allocate that money to various cities. Maybe they give the valley some money to improve the bus system or create an inter-valley rail system. Create more light rail in cities like San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, right? Try to relieve some of the congestion on the roads. We also get money from the federal government for education, welfare, and healthcare. So some of it is just the federal government gives Texas the money, Texas gives the money to the cities, and the cities then spend it on whatever area the money is allocated for. Basically, what goes around comes around. You pay your federal taxes, and then those taxes come back to Texas. Okay, so there's only so much money in the budget. There's only so much money that's available for cities. And you have to spend the money on things like roads and bridges, right? You gotta make sure, normally, that there aren't potholes on all the major roads. Obviously, there are clear exceptions here in the valley, but usually they try to make sure the roads aren't damn near impassable. They have to spend money on law enforcement, of course, local police officers, healthcare, got to help pay for Medicare, Medicaid, etc. Parks, libraries, public transportation where there is public transportation, fire protection, and public utilities. So the city gets the money, but then the money pretty much goes right back out again. So they have to decide what takes priority. Recently, Weslaco decided to spend a ton of money building a new jail. Obviously, the city council said that's more of a priority. I honestly think they should be spending it on fixing the damn roads, but that's not up to us, right? They get to decide how they're going to spend the money. And when there is a recession, the state and city budgets do tend to get hit quite a bit. When we went into the worst recession since the Great Depression between 2007 to 2009, the federal government did allocate money for the states to try to stimulate the economy. But the longer the recession went on, the less money there was for the states, and the harder people got hit. Every state saw high unemployment rates, the housing market crashed, high rates of homelessness. It was a very, very bad time. And there was not enough money to help everyone who needed help. So part of the problem too is if the federal government tells us you're spending this money on health care, local government doesn't have a choice on that. If Congress says this money can only be for health care, they can't spend it on education. They have to abide by the rules set down by the federal government. Even if they don't want to, it's not up to them. We're also seeing more people coming into the state, but not enough revenue to match the demands of more people needing transportation, fire protection, water access, etc. And while the state income tax is unpopular with the voters, the reality is because we don't have one, we are limited in how much money we can raise from property taxes, sale taxes, and exceedingly low business taxes. Texas wants to be seen as friendly to business. The problem with that is you're not charging businesses enough taxes to keep up with demand. So the state is constantly short of money. There's never enough money to fund everything all of the time. And that's why the sales tax is higher in Texas compared to other states, because we don't have a state income tax, and we don't charge high business taxes. So if you've ever wondered why it seems higher compared to other states, that's partly why. Okay, for local governments, there's a variety of problems. Mass transit doesn't really exist in Texas outside of the major cities. It was almost non-existent in Texas until 1978, when the state finally realized there's too many damn cars on the road, we gotta do something about it. But we still haven't fixed that problem, right? There's still a huge number of cars on the roads in Texas. And it's unfortunate that there isn't mass transit outside of the cities. It would be so much easier if you could just hop on the bus and go straight from Weslaco to McAllen and back. Or get on a train in Brownsville and go to McAllen and go back, right? Make it easier for people not to have to drive all the damn time. So that's a problem. Also, there's issues with strategic planning. You're trading one area of concern for another. You're basically saying, we're going to delay dealing with this problem. So, for example, a company comes in and says, we want to build a new Amazon warehouse. Okay, but there are going to be environmental consequences. You're going to have to build it somewhere. You're going to have ideas, you're going to have problems with pollution. But basically what they're saying is, well, we'll take the economic benefits and we'll deal with the environmental concerns later. Because we'd rather have the money now, and we can just push this down the line and we'll figure out what to do about this later. So it's always a trade-off. What takes priority? And that's a battle that they're still trying to figure out. So what we tend to see is a lot of what's called interlocal cooperation. A lot of problems aren't limited to just one city. Flooding doesn't recognize city boundaries. Crime doesn't recognize city boundaries. Pollution doesn't recognize city boundaries. So you need to have things like city-county ambulances. If you live out in the middle of nowhere, you still need to be able to get fire, ambulance, and police services. City school playgrounds, libraries that are shared between communities, multiple city purchasing of equipment. So you gotta find a way to work together to solve some of these common problems. If you have one hospital serving 4 different communities, then you gotta make sure people have a way to get to that hospital. You got to make sure that all of the communities are paying for the cost of that shared hospital. And part of the problem we see is that cities can't necessarily pass local ordinances. If they set up an adult bookstore just outside the city limits, they can't really do anything about that. And some companies are smart enough to know the rules. They know exactly where the city limits end, and they set up shop right outside of that, so the city can't do anything about it. The city may not like an adult store being there, but they can't do anything about that. And also, if you're building a new suburb outside of the city limits, then they're not subject to city environmental regulations or building codes like soundproof walls, flooding proof things, right? You could be moving into an apartment complex where you can hear your neighbor flushing the toilet, and there's not much you can do about that, unfortunately. And it is expensive for the cities as they keep growing. If you have more and more people moving to the suburbs, but still using city utilities, then you're losing some of those tax dollars. You also have to deal with the fact that more people are moving in, more suburbs are coming up, more people are making demands on the city budget, and inevitably there's just not enough money to pay for everything. And it's hard to control things like setting off fireworks. I think it was like 4th of July, the day after, some idiot where my parents were was setting off loud fireworks at like 2 in the morning. Everybody's like, what the hell are you doing? But there's not much that can be done about it. I mean, you could try to call law enforcement, but by the time they get there, it might be over, right? So all you can do is post about it and be like, hey, jerk face, try not to do that again, you know? Not much control you have over those things. And it also matters who's in charge. The pay will vary for elected officials. If you're in a major city, you're going to get a pretty decent salary. If you're in a small town, mostly you might get paid for parking, any meals you take on the job, and maybe a stipend, but that's it. So in a small town with not a lot of pay for leadership, it's going to be mostly business owners who kind of see this as an extension of their service to other businesses. So it's going to be run like a business, which has its benefits and drawbacks. And in small areas, you do tend to see the local government having very strong control. The commission, most people may be afraid to cross the commission. The people who serve on the board may have absolute power over education, environmental regulation, and so on. They're big fish in a small pond, and they're going to use that to their advantage. Now, the good thing about city governments is in more urban areas, we see more young people running for office, more minorities, and more women. As I've said before, if you want to be a career politician, then the first step is run for city council, then run for county, then state, and then national, right? Work your way up the ladder. Make those connections, find those donors, get the support of the party. So we do see young people stepping up and saying, I want to run for Senate one day, so I'm going to start off on the local level and work my way up, which is actually a pretty smart idea. President Obama did the same thing, started off in Chicago politics, then he went to the Illinois Senate, then the US Senate, and then president. So it's not a bad first step for career politicians. Unfortunately, the Texas Association of County Officials is still largely dominated by the more rural interests. Texas is becoming more and more urban. That doesn't mean the government's really kept up with that necessarily. We still see a lot of control by people in the agriculture and livestock industries. So Texas hasn't quite caught up to the reality that we're moving away from a rural agricultural state to a largely urban industrial state. We're still kind of in that state of transition. And there's other organizations that come into play, like the Texas Municipal League and the Texas Public Power Association. And you'll see city and county officials getting together, hosting events, holding joint meetings, talking about common issues. There's a lot of connections. You see a lot of people in local government talking to their counterparts in another city, making connections, trying to work together to solve common problems. So local government is not sexy. It's not glamorous. It's not something we tend to pay as much attention to. But it is the most important form of government. It's our first line of contact. They're the first people we call if our building loses power or our water gets shut off. They control our local education, recycling programs, and a whole bunch of other areas we don't necessarily think about. So it's not the most glamorous, but it is the most important. So if you're going to really pay attention to any area of politics, if you really be on the local level, you should know who your mayor is, or at least have some idea who they are. Pay attention to local elections. Try to find out what the different candidates stand for and participate in these elections. It's easier said than done, but it is a very important thing that we really should try to make more of an effort to do, myself included. Okay, any questions? Any questions online? Okay, so just a reminder, research papers are due tonight by 11:59 p.m. If you've already turned in your paper, you're good to go. If you're still writing your paper, type fast. I'm kidding, please be done with your papers, but make sure I have them tonight by 11:59 p.m. If there's a problem with Blackboard, if it's not working tonight, just let me know. Hopefully there won't be any issues. And I've been asked about the score you see with Safe Assign. Don't panic when you see the score unless you're over like 50%. Most of the time, what it's flagging is coincidental things. You've cited the same source as someone else whose paper's in the database. You've used the same quote. This sentence sounds somewhat similar to this sentence. Most of it's just coincidental stuff. But if you look at your score and you're like, that seems high, take another look at your paper, make sure you've cited everything, and you should be good to go. Okay? Any last minute questions on the paper? You guys are just glad to be done with it, right? Yeah. Been there. Okay, so we're going to start on chapter 12 next week. So read the first half of chapter 12 for Monday. And if you have any questions over the weekend, you can email me or call or text my cell phone. It's going to take me a little while to grade papers, so don't expect to see your grade right away. But if it's going to take me longer than a week or so, I'll let you guys know so you're not wondering where your grade is. But once it's graded, you'll be able to see your grade and feedback in Blackboard pretty much right away. So I'll try to keep you posted on that so you're not freaking out. All right, enjoy your weekend.